So another day and more Alabama football news that we have got to dive into. And today we have two massive topics we need to cover. First and foremost, we need to talk about the topic taking social media by storm, the topic that so many Alabama fans out there were hoping to avoid hearing. And that's that star safety Caleb Downs intends to enter the transfer portal. But on top of that, we also need to talk about a hire that Alabama made yesterday for the vacant defensive backs coach position. And today, we need to dive into it all. But before we can, as always, y'all know the drill. I've got to hear from you. Hop down to the comments, give me a Y for yes or an N for no. Are you surprised that Caleb Downs intends to enter the transfer portal? And let me know what you're thinking. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe, hit that bell notification as I do constant college football content. You don't want to miss any of it, and if you enjoy the content, be sure to like and comment down below. But having said all that, let's dive right into this. And we have got to start with the news taking social media by storm, and that's that star safety Caleb Downs intends to enter the transfer portal, and this is a massive blow to the Crimson Tide. There's no arguing around it. If you look at all the players that have entered the transfer portal thus far, in my opinion, it's not particularly close which player is the biggest impact loss. It's Caleb Downs, and it's Caleb Downs by a wide margin. Yes, Alabama has lost talented players. They've lost players that were starters, but when you look, the big starter they lost was on the offensive side of the ball, and when you look at the offensive staff Alabama is bringing in, I think the wide receiver room is going to be just fine. When you look at what DeBoer, what Grubb, and what Shepard did at Washington, and every stop they've had, I think the offense and the wide receiver play for Alabama is going to be a lot of fun to watch. But defensively is where so many people have had so many questions, and for good reason. Nick Saban, the GOAT, was a defensive-minded coach, and under his reign, Alabama was known for their hard-nosed defenses, and especially Nick Saban's ability to develop not only defensive players, but develop players in general. But if we are diving into it, the work he did with defensive backs is second to none. Getting in defensive backs, working with them, developing them, and sending them off to have successful NFL careers, where Alabama is unquestionably NFLU right now. That was a big deal. And whenever we look at which room has been hit the hardest by the transfer portal since Nick Saban retired, it's the defensive back room. That's the area where several names have popped up in the transfer portal, whether we're talking about Des Ricks, Kite, Amos, and now Caleb Downs. That's an area where Alabama is going to have a lot of questions going into the 2024 season just because of all of the guys that have left. And yes, Alabama signed a very impressive freshman class of defensive backs. Several of those guys, I think, have otherworld ability, but they don't have experience. They're all going to be young guys, and seeing those young guys learn and develop in this new defense, it's going to be exciting, but they do not have the experience that a Caleb Downs provides or an Amos provides. That's something that I think Alabama is going to be missing. And whenever we look at Caleb Downs, this is someone that people were hoping the new defensive coordinator, the new defensive backs coach, and the staff in general would be able to talk into staying. And as I said, just because his name enters the transfer portal or he intends to enter the transfer portal doesn't mean he's a foregone conclusion that he will leave. But I also think it's important to be realistic about this situation. And when we look at Caleb Downs, there were three people that were instrumental in his recruiting process. The first and foremost being Nick Saban, and we just talked about Nick Saban. So many of these guys dream of going to Alabama, not only to play for the Crimson Tide, but to be coached by none other than the GOAT himself, especially these guys that are defensive backs, because they know they're going to be able to work one-on-one with Nick Saban all the time. And that knowledge, there's no replicating that. And so if you're a defensive back at Alabama and all of a sudden Nick Saban retires, that's a major blow. But then we get to the second figure that was so instrumental for Caleb Downs, and that's Travaris Robinson. When Nick Saban retired, many people, including myself, thought that the move to make was elevating Travaris Robinson to defensive coordinator. Heck, if we even go back to when Kevin Steele retired, in the video I made then, I was saying, hey, I think the move to make, if you're asking me, and not that my opinion matters for anything, retain T-Rob. Elevate him to defensive coordinator, and this is even before Saban retired. I thought that was the move to make because the relationship T-Rob has with players on the team. His recruiting ability, it was massive for Alabama. But whenever he wasn't retained and then Georgia offered him a co-defensive coordinator position and he took it, there were a lot of questions that came about. Now all of a sudden you don't have Nick Saban. Now you don't have T-Rob. And the third name that was instrumental in Caleb Downs' recruiting process was Charles Kelly. But Charles Kelly left last year. So he was big for helping Alabama get Caleb Downs, but it's not like Caleb Downs had a long-standing relationship with him once he hit campus because Kelly went to Colorado. So now you're sitting there and you're asking yourself, what's Alabama's secondary going to look like? And that is going to be the chief question for the defense, in my opinion. What will the secondary look like? How many of these young guys will be featured in there? Or is Alabama going to have to hit the transfer portal and have to hit it hard, both now and when the portal opens back up in the spring? These are all questions that we're not going to have answers for yet, but one thing we do know, without question, that losing Caleb Downs is a massive hit. If we look at what he did for Alabama this past year, it was nothing short of incredible. This is someone that had 107 tackles, led the Crimson Tide in tackles, being the first freshman to do so, maybe ever, but if not ever, in quite a long time. He had 2 interceptions, he had a forced fumble, and he returned a punt for a kickoff. And the scary thing about it, he's just beginning to become the player he could be. This is someone who has got a lot of ability that looks to be a lock for a first-round draft pick, and wherever he ends up, they're getting the best player that has hit the transfer portal yet. And I mean any player since they've hit the portal. If you were to create a list, I don't think it's any question who the best player to enter the portal from the 2023-2024 season is. It's Caleb Downs, and I don't think it's particularly close. Obviously, people are going to ask who the teams to watch for Caleb Downs. The first team you have to throw out there is Georgia, just considering that's where T-Rob ended up and Caleb Downs is from Georgia. The other team that you'd be remiss if you didn't mention is Ohio State, being that they finished second in his recruitment, and they were a team that was continually chipping away. But this gets us into the other question and the other topic at hand. Alabama hires Maurice Linguist as their defensive backs coach, and Linguist comes by way of being the head coach at Buffalo. But more important than that, he has recruiting ties to the SEC. This is someone who is born in Dallas, who played at Baylor, who then coached at Texas A&M, and then at the Dallas Cowboys. But if we really focus in on what he did at Texas A&M, he recruited at a high level for the Aggies. He worked with Michigan for just a short period of time, but was big in them landing Will Johnson. And during his time at Minnesota, he was big in them landing some big-time players there as well. The question that so many people were hoping to be answered when he was hired is, are you going to be able to retain Caleb Downs? Fast forward to now, and it looks like that's going to be a massive uphill battle if it's possible at all. So this is going to be something we need to watch, but it is good to see DeBoer and staff get in a guy that has head coaching experience at a position coach, that has a lot of coaching experience and has recruiting ties to the SEC. But at the end of the day, this is the day that Alabama fans were hoping to avoid. This is the news they were hoping to avoid hearing. Yes, everybody knew that there would be players entering the transfer portal when Nick Saban retired, but of everybody that's left, this is the biggest loss thus far, and it's not particularly close. Hop down to the comments, let me know what you're thinking. That's it. See ya.